We have been in a series on God's plan for giving. And in the 5 messages that we have given so far, we have said that giving should be in response to need, it should be in response to God's command, it should be sacrificial, it should be secret and humble, and it should be the key to spiritual fruit. We also talked about the problem of accumulation and the antidote to greed, as well as looked at the issues of the heart. And then finally, we addressed 3 questions. They were, how are we to feel about money? How are we to earn money? And how are we to spend money? We answered the first question, how are we to feel about money, by saying that we are not to love it, we are not to trust it, and we're not to seek rich or regard it as our own. In the second question, we addressed it from 2 perspectives. One was negative, and the other was positive. Negatively speaking, we said we are not to steal it, nor are we to defraud others of it, and we're not to gamble. When we looked at it in a positive light, we said that the Bible teaches us that we are to earn money by working. And then in the last question, how are we to spend money? We said by providing for our families, by paying our debts, and by supporting the church, and by saving. And now we come to the last area in our series, and it has to do with tithing. I don't know if you've been asking the question for the last 5 weeks, will we ever deal with this subject? Because we've said a lot about money, but we haven't said anything about tithing. So what about tithing? What is it? And what does the Bible say about it? Well, first of all, let me say what is traditionally taught. Tithing, as it is taught, is where you give 10% of your income to God, and it's a command, and it is not voluntary. The text that is used to prove this teaching among many is Malachi 3:8, which says, "Will a man rob God? Yet you are robbing me, but you say, how have we robbed you? In tithes and offerings." But I have a question. Is that really what that verse is saying? I've struggled sitting in congregations early on in my Christian experience and being guilted by this verse and being guilted by other verses, and it's led a series of questions in my own mind, and it's led me to my own personal study to answer this question. And you have to ask even another question. If this is not what this is teaching, then how come we keep teaching this? How come we keep guilting the people into tithing if the Bible doesn't teach tithing? Well, that's the questions to be answered. Does the Bible teach tithing as it's traditionally taught? Some say that tithing goes back to the Old Testament, where the Mosaic Law required the Israelites to pay various tithes. They even say that before the law, Abraham and Jacob gave tithes to the Lord. And since the practice of tithing appeared before the law, it must transcend the law. In other words, tithing has to apply after the time of the law to today, as a universal standard and an unchanging requirement of giving. Well, there's several problems with this view. First, arguing that whatever existed before the law must exist after the law, it poses some real problems. For example, in the Mosaic Law, Israel was to keep the Sabbath. Remember that? Exodus 20, verses 9 through 11? But in the New Testament, it's clearly set aside by Jesus and also by Paul. Paul said in Colossians 2:16 and 17, "Therefore no one is to act as your judge in regard to food or drink or in respect to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath day, things which are a mere shadow of what is to come. But the substance belongs to Christ." All of these things pointed to the coming of the Messiah. When the Messiah came, all these things ended. Same is true about the sacrificial system. The offering of animal sacrifices took place as early as Abel's time in Genesis 4:4, and an even more detailed system was established in the Mosaic Law. But in the New Covenant, it does not continue because it was superseded by Christ's work on the cross. Today, we don't offer animals to the Lord, do we? And just because a certain requirement or practice existed before and during the time of the law does not make it permanently applicable in the New Covenant. Now, there are basically two types of giving taught consistently in Scripture. It's taught in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. There was compulsory giving, or we could call required giving, and that was giving to the government. And then there was giving to God, which was always voluntary. So as we explore this subject this evening, I want us to look at giving before Moses, giving from Moses to Jesus, giving from Jesus to the present, and look at these two types of giving, free will and required giving. Let's look first of all at giving before Moses. Now, before we can consider any of the early examples of giving in the Old Testament, it's important to know that in the book of Genesis, the Hebrew word that's translated tithe did not refer to required giving. It was not a divine commandment or an ordinance. Instead, the term referred to voluntary giving. The Hebrew word, which is translated tithe, means a tenth part. It's the same as the Greek word. It simply means a tenth. It's not a religious word. It is a mathematical word, and it has to do with a percentage. And we know that nearly all ancient cultures used the number 10, get this, as a symbol of completeness. And we see this sometimes in Scripture. For example, you have the 10 plagues which God sent on the Egyptians. Then you have the 10 commandments. That's a symbol of completion. Even when a pagan worshiper wanted to give an offering to their deity, they would give a tenth because that symbolized their giving of everything. So we need to first understand that the word tithe, it only meant a tenth, and it symbolized a totality or a completeness. Now, when we consider giving before Moses, we're drawn to the first offering that's mentioned in the Bible. It's found in Genesis chapter 4. So let me have you to turn to Genesis chapter 4 as we see the offering given by Cain and Abel. Genesis chapter 4 and verse 3. It says, "So it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the first or of the fruit of the ground, and Abel on his part also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and for his offering." Now, the interesting thing about these two verses is that this offering was voluntary. Nowhere do we read that this was a required offering. It was a free choice on their part. Cain gave of the fruit of the ground. Abel brought an animal sacrifice. There was no requirement. There was no amount, no stipulation, no frequency enjoyed upon them. It was completely at their own will. Now, some may even ask the question, how come the Lord did not accept Cain's offering? Well, I have a suggestion, and I kind of was picking up on this as I was studying, something that we'll hit on later on in just a few moments. If you'll notice there, he says again that Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground. Abel, on his part, also brought of the firstlings of his flock. In other words, Abel brought the best of the top, the best of his flock, the best of the fat portions. And it's possible that Cain didn't do that Cain didn't give the first. Cain just brought whatever he had from the fruit of the ground. Now, that's a big possibility. Now, I know that's speculating, and so you can take that however you want to take it. I know when you get to heaven, you're going to ask and find out, right? So unfortunately, we'll have to wait till then. So as far as we can see from this passage right here, there's nothing imposed upon them. There's no required giving. This was freely upon their own doing.